The War of 1812 was a byproduct of a much larger European conflict. As historian Donald R. Hickey wrote, Great Britain and France fought off and on for more than a century to determine which nation would dominate Europe and the wider world. After Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson's great victory over the French and Spanish fleets in the Battle of Trafalgar, 1805, Great Britain controlled the sea. Yet, 6 weeks after Trafalgar, Napoleon won the equally decisive battle at Austerlitz. France was the master of the continent. With each belligerent supreme in its element, they could only wage war by targeting one another's trade. The young United States needed to conduct overseas commerce to strengthen her credit, expand her economy, and increase her money supply. So the U.S. landed in the middle of the British and French fight for Western hegemony. With a small army and navy, the United States was an easy target. Yet because commerce and trade were essential to American stability and growth, Britain's domination of the sea lanes and her encroachment upon American neutrality rights were considered more serious. The Jefferson administration considered 5 options in America's attempt to solve the dilemma. 1, we would continue to allow Great Britain to impress American sailors. We could place an embargo on trade with both Britain and France. 3, we could do nothing and wait and see future developments. 4, we could try to absorb Florida, Cuba, and Canada as we had with the Louisiana Territory. Or 5, we could go to war. Hi, I'm Tom Army, and this is part 5 of our series on the early republic and the causes of the War of 1812. The Jefferson administration had tried an embargo on trade with Britain and France, but smuggling along the Canadian border made the embargo ineffective. As historian Walter A. McDougall pointed out, what followed the embargo attempt was worse. 5 days after a new president, James Madison, was inaugurated, Congress passed a Non-Intercourse Act that still forbade trade with Britain and France so long as Britain's orders in council and France's decrees remained in effect. However, the new law failed to prevent American ship owners and merchants from practicing illicit trade with the enemy. Casting about for something that might work in 1810, Nathaniel Bacon's Bill No. 2 legalized trade with belligerents while threatening to reimpose the embargo against one if the other lifted restrictions. Napoleon immediately promised to revoke his maritime decrees. Napoleon lied. Yet Madison, who suspected Napoleon's promise was manipulative, imposed an embargo against Britain anyway. Madison's decision was portentous. and Parliament viewed the measure as threatening. Albert Gallatin had amassed evidence showing both an increase in trade along the Canadian border and a flood of Canadian exports of commodities smuggled from the United States, landing in the West Indies. During this second Hundreds-Year War, Britain invested heavily in agriculture, immigration, and fortifications. Since Napoleon closed Britain's Baltic Sea sources, Canada provided the Royal Navy with masts, tar, pitch, and hemp. Canada's value to Britain was clear. Madison understood that his embargo of exports to Britain would only be effective if the Canadian loophole was closed. Britain understood this as well. Furthermore, sanctions had cut British imports to the United States by more than 80%. A recession struck England, and unemployment was high. Shawnee leaders Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa were determined to renounce the ways of whites and to prevent the further confiscation of their lands. Many Americans believed that British Major General Isaac Brock and his small Canadian militia forces and Indian allies were behind the growing unrest among the Shawnees and their confederation. In late 1811, William Henry Harrison, future President of the United States, defeated the Indians at the Battle of Tippecanoe and destroyed the native settlements at Prophetstown, near modern-day Battle Ground, Indiana. The result was that many Native Americans believed their only hope of stemming further encroachments by American settlers lay with the British. Americans also believed that Britain's removal from Canada would end their Indian problems. Canadians suspected that American expansionists were using Indian unrest as an excuse for a war of conquest. The American expansionists were called warhawks. The warhawks were a pro-war Western and Southern faction of the Republican Party, and their most vocal advocate was Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House. The Speaker was mild about French provocations. He enjoined his fellow citizens to see the new United States, embracing not only the old 13 states, but the entire country east of the Mississippi, including East Florida, and some of the territories to the north of us also. Later, he derided the idea of America ever making conciliatory gestures to Britain. He said, "I am not for stopping at Quebec or anywhere else, but I would take the whole continent from them and ask no favors." Sir August John Foster, Britain's current minister to the United States, reported to London that Clay and his friends always talked to me of war as a duel. They seemed to think war was as necessary to their young nation as dueling was to a young man of honor. To his mother, the Duchess of Devonshire, Foster wrote, "A great many people here in the United States are afraid of being laughed at if they don't fight." These remarks were an exaggeration, of course, but the Warhawks believed that too many aggravations had been tolerated for too long at too high a cost to American honor. Another Warhawk, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, told Americans to quit being afraid and attack past ghosts, present tormentors, and doubts clouding the future. The Warhawks argued, sounding much like the previous revolutionary generation, that a war would not be just against the old world, but for a bolder vision of the new world. Some Republicans and all Federalists believe the Warhawks' words were inflammatory and dangerous. Wealthy merchants and professional men, especially in the northern states, felt the war would not come. Furthermore, they expected the president and other Warhawks to tone down their braggadocio. Some Federalists argued that if the country determined war was necessary, the best place to defend the nation's maritime rights was on the high seas. President Madison bears responsibility for what happened next. First, the president sent his annual message when the 12th Congress convened on November 4th, 1811. The message focused on the American demand to revoke the British orders in council and call on Congress to put the nation into the armor and attitude demanded by the crisis. Next, on March 9th, 1812, Madison informed Congress of a British plot to incite disunion in Federalist New England. As it turned out, the documents acquired from a British spy named John Henry implicated no one, but simply reported to British officials on political conditions in New England. Federalists were furious over the attempt to impugn their loyalty. In addition, they discovered that someone had purchased the documents for the princely sum of $50,000 rather than freely given, as Henry's cover letter had implied. Congress took another belligerent step in early April by enacting a 90-day embargo and non-exportation law. Even with these actions, however, many Americans refused to believe war was at hand. Josiah Quincy of Massachusetts claimed that the talk of war was ludicrous. There were rumors that Great Britain would rescind the orders in council. The Admiralty ordered all naval officers to avoid clashes with the American Navy and to exercise all possible forbearance towards American citizens. Finally, on June 16th, Lord Castlereagh, the British Foreign Secretary, announced in Parliament that he would suspend the orders in council and he would scrap the whole system of blockades. Yet, on June 18th, 1812, the United States declared war.